Welcome to another episode of History Tea Time, one sip of history at a time. Coined by Charles Sumner in 1847, the term white slavery constitutes Christian slavery in the Barbary Coast and Ottoman Algeria. This system was a little different from other slavery systems in the US and the Caribbean, as there was not only racial segregation, but also gender division. Today, we'll discuss 10 things about white slavery in the Ottoman Empire. Click on the like button and subscribe for more such content. Number 1. Slave markets existed in every city or town. Sold in marketplaces called yesia, situated in every city or town. White slaves of every age and sex were on show. They were presented bare and nude so that they could be checked up and down. There was special interest in young slaves, especially girls. In Istanbul, beautiful girls and boys were in high demand in the slave markets. They were bought in a market close to the Grand Bazaar till 1846, as the sales were closed down by Sultan Abdulmecid. The prostitutes, better known as sex workers today, also sold their services in these markets. Number 2. Both men and women slaves existed. White men and women were both sold in this slavery institution. Women slaves who had long hair and colored eyes were always in the spotlight. The free men and the Sultan always requested women slaves of such demeanor, which became a part of the bigger sexual abuse system. Even male slaves were sometimes sold in this manner. In contrast to the free men, free women of Ottoman society wanted slaves who could do household chores, were physically strong, and were easygoing. These women masters also often looked for beauty in their slaves, so that they could show them off. Number 3. Slave masters were supposed to take care of their slaves under Islamic law. The white slaves were connected to their masters in mukataba, a settlement. The slave masters were often seen as men who maltreated women and abused them sexually. But it was so much more than that. The role of the slave master involved taking care of the slave under Islamic law. If a female slave gave birth to her master's child, she was to be wedded to the master himself or others and be set free. However, there are non-ending instances of masters' brutality against their slaves. The masters sold them into prostitution instead of fulfilling their duties. In 1853, Selim, a male slave, was subjected to atrocious torture as his slave master cut his arms from his wrists and slashed his balls and penis. Number 4. Women slaves had some degree of freedom. White female slaves were often employed in the domestic sphere by free women. They were required to serve coffee, attend to dinner trays, and perform as nursemaids. White women slaves were required to serve their masters for a minimum of 9 years. Sexual slavery was a central part of the system. That being said, Europeans from the 19th century recounted that white women slaves had quite an amount of freedom. After being freed from slavery, a white woman slave would typically marry an Ottoman man, or she could stay with her master's family. Young girl slaves who were bought as companions for their daughters to serve the family or as a part of the harem were often dressed in the same as their daughters and could marry into their master's families. Number 5. Women slaves were often sexually abused. Simply because the white women slaves had some freedom did not mean that they were not treated in a rough manner. The capture of Circassian girls to be traded into Constantinople as carriers was common. The virginity of every young female slave was inspected by a midwife. For some, the buyers would pretend to take them away in pretense of checking and sexually abuse them for the whole day and return them to the dealers. Even the citizens of the Ottoman Empire were not safe, as prostitutes on the streets were captured by slave traders for selling. How were these women captured? How were the rest of the white slaves sold? Click on the like button and subscribe to History Tea Time to find out more about such tragic historical events and their impact on humanity. Number 6. Ottoman pirates acted as slave dealers. Now that you know a little bit about the context of white slaves in the Ottoman Empire, let's now talk about how the slaves became slaves in the first place. Ottoman ships, led by pirates, would reach European grounds and pillage and ransack their motherlands. From there, they would take back slaves. In one instance in 1627, during these pirates' stay in Iceland, a woman named Honest Helen narrates that they came into their territories and captured people from inside their homes and public markets. They also did not fail to capture people hiding inside the mountains. While doing so, they ignited all the churches and killed everyone who was of no use to them. The ship was transporting slaves to Algiers. These pirates had their oddities too, tells Helen. She remembers how one of them would daily demand to be bathed and had others wash his body with water. It was the same guy who killed her husband. Number 7. The Sultan perpetuated the slave trade himself. Besides pirates, another source of white slave creation came from the Sultan himself. The Ottoman Sultan had a right to 1/5 of the booty of the spoils of war. This usually meant materialistic elements. However, the Sultan also extended his rights into recruiting captives or slaves into their harems and military operations. Records show there were around a minimum of 25,000 European slaves at the palace of Sultan Ismail at any time. The Sultan drafted youthful Christian males from Anatolia and Balkan and put them in the practice of divsherm, where soldiers were recruited by force. He also had an imperial harem or seraglio harem of his own. Number 8. Using obscurity in the Islamic law as an excuse for slavery. The Quran sees slaves as of equal level to regular free people, except in their legal status. However, it is still not considered illegal or haram, like the eating of pork is. This obscurity in the Quran was exploited by Ottoman rulers for their selfish purposes. For example, Sultan Abdul Hamid II, Sultan of the Ottoman Empire from 1976 to 1909, when questioned whether he had taken any steps to prevent the slave trade, used this exact obscurity in the Quran as the basis for his response in a letter to the British Consul General of the time. He mentioned that all sects of Islam are of the same view that slaves are not illegal in their religion, and he cannot do anything about it since it has been the norm since Adam's time. He also proclaimed that unlike other slavery systems, Islamic law prohibits any rough treatment of its slaves, which meant that slavery in the Islamic context was not bad, and just a fact of life. Number 9. The Sultan had an imperial harem. When you think of a harem, your mind immediately jumps to an old sheikh reveling in the midst of beautiful women. This image actually comes from the 16th and 17th Ottoman Empire harems, also known as seraglio harems. Harems were pivotal in governing matters of the state. When they arrived at the palace, the women were converted to Islam and were christened with new names in accordance with their appearance or disposition. They were banned from connecting with their families and were trained in the manners of the Ottoman court and Islam. The females were recruited in a variety of manners. In war, provided as gifts to the Sultan and his family, or obtained from other countries to become carriers, namely court ladies. The harem was made of new court ladies at regular intervals since periodic emancipation existed in Islam. The majority of the young women were Christian and came from Georgia, Russia, and Circassia. Number 10. There was a palace school of both white and black eunuchs. Eunuchs were castrated men. White eunuchs were captured from Balkan lands. In early periods, from Armenia, Georgia, and Caucasia, and in later times as prisoners of war from Hungary, Slovenia, and Germany. The chief white eunuch was called the Karpiaga. The Karpiaga headed the palace school for eunuchs and the inner service, namely the bureaucracy. He also headed the hospital, rituals, and was gatekeeper-in-chief. All the documents or missives sent to the Sultan were under his control. However, due to a variety of crimes, including embezzlement and closeness to women of the harem, in 1591, all of his powers were transferred to the black eunuch, the Kaisler Aga. Many white eunuchs had incomplete castrations and were in possession of their penis, so the Sultan prohibited their contact with the harem. During all times, each imperial harem had around 300 to 900 white eunuchs. Even if the slavery for white women, eunuchs, and others was gentle in nature, it doesn't mean the institution in itself was not a problem. In the words of Robert Davis, slaves were slaves, whether they are black or white. History textbooks usually leave out these parts for political reasons. Before leaving, do click on the like and subscribe buttons. Also, share this with your friends to spread more information about the shady aspects of history. Thanks for watching.